Welcome to DSCJ Home Classes. Dear students, in the previous video, we discussed Nelson Mandela a bit. And in this video, we will continue with the same chapter we were doing, and it is Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. It is actually an autobiography. Here, Nelson Mandela speaks about his own self, about the freedom struggle, about that apartheid, about that day, the inauguration day, the ceremony day on which he was going to be the first black president of South Africa. After the first fully representative democratic elections in the country. It was actually after 300 years of white supremacy, 300 years of discrimination, that they were able to get the system. They were able to get the trump over that apartheid, trump over that racist moment, or racialism and all that. This is actually an autobiography. He then speaks about his speech. I will read the part of that speech which is here in the text of this Long Walk to Freedom. I will read out to you that text also. But he starts this chapter with mentioning the date, the 10th May 1994, and which he calls it dawned very bright and clear. It is a clear hint of the change in South Africa, which Nelson Mandela and his comrades brought there. Actually, he speaks about he speaks about those dignitaries, those bold leaders, who besieged him before that ceremony, and who came there to pay respect to them, and it was the largest gathering ever of international leaders on South African soil. It is said there in the very first paragraph of the chapter. Actually, it was 10th May. And it was there was a sworn in ceremony was going to happen there, and where he was sworn in, the first black president of South Africa. The deputy presidents were also elected, and it is called the Autumn Day. The 10th May is called the Autumn Day. It is because I must tell you that in South Africa actually falls in the southern hemisphere, where the autumn season is from March to May, and in the northern hemisphere, the March to May is the season of spring, like we have in India. So it is the one reason that the 10th May is called the Autumn Day, and the another symbolic you can say hint is that it was Autumn Day because it was going to be they were going to have the fruit of their struggle, which is it is actually Autumn Day because after that long period of the slavery, of that white supremacy, their discrimination, which those black ones had to face. Now it was the day where South Africa had to they're going to get the fruits of that struggle which they did there, and in the form of the government, in the form of the democracy, in the form of in the form of victory of those black people, or in the form of victory of common people of South Africa, where there is going to be no discrimination after that date, after 10th May, when Mandela sworn in as the first black president of Africa. That's why it's called Autumn Day in the chapter. So that ceremony was held in Pretoria, It was held in the amphitheater of in Pretoria, Union Buildings in Pretoria. It was held there, where the large number of dignitaries, politicians, world leaders were invited there, and there were lakhs of people, men and women. Everybody was there who were going to celebrate that day, who were going to celebrate that victory. And then after that, when the first deputy and second deputy presidents were, when they, when they were sworn in, and then it was the turn of Mandela, who pledged to obey and uphold the constitution, who pledged to work for the poor, who pledged for the well-being of the republic of its republic and its people. And to his guests, and to his all these guests and all these world leaders who were there, his audience, he addressed them, and then he spoke certain words to them. I would like to read it from the text. Let's read it. Dear students, you can see clearly the pic of Nelson Mandela, who was of black complexion, and then it's the speech of his goes here. It is, today all of us do by our presence here confer glory and hope to newborn liberty. Out of experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud. We, who were outlaws not so long ago, have today been given the rare privilege to be hosts to the nations of the world on our own soil. We thank all of our distinguished international guests for having come to take possession with the people of our country of what is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa. Speech, we see that he speaks of newborn liberty, and then we also saw that he says that out of it there must be born a society, which is of which all humanity will be proud. And then he also say that they were considered to be outlaws before that, but after their victory they had been given the privilege of hosting hosting that ceremony, or to be the host of those world leaders, to be the host of the whole world. He speaks of that, and then he also thanks his guests for coming there, and he calls it that day particularly a common victory for justice, peace, and human dignity, which was nowhere seen till then there in South Africa. He calls the rule before them an extraordinary human disaster. He calls the rule of white supremacy extraordinary human disaster, because it has damaged humanity very much. And then he also speaks about his their political emancipation. He calls that day, he calls that freedom, the political emancipation, because now everybody could take part in politics, whether it is white, whether it is black. And then he speaks about getting freedom from the bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. And he also pledges to liberate his people from all these vices. And then he says that their country, their nation will never experience such oppression by anyone there. And then he also says that the sun shall never set on the glorious human, this glorious human achievement. He calls it a glorious human achievement, the victory of South Africans. And then he ends his speech by this sentence: let freedom reign, God bless Africa. Let freedom reign. Now there was to be freedom everywhere. Everybody was to have freedom. Everybody was to have liberty, whatever he or she wishes to have. And then there is actually demonstration of military force and loyalty to democracy. Then we can see, you might have seen on Republic Day, especially in India, those jets, helicopters, choppers, military forces. Actually, they display their power. When the ceremony of that Republic Day is, there going there in Delhi, and you can see the people there in the ceremony. They can see those jets and choppers and all that hovering over them. In the similar fashion, there was demonstration of this military force here. Those jets and those choppers and helicopters could be seen, hovering over those Union buildings in Pretoria. They were very happy about that. And it was not just the demonstration of military force, but Nelson calls it loyalty to democracy. It was their loyalty. It was a loyalty of military to their democracy. He speaks of those highest generals of South African Defense Force and police. They were bedecked, they were decorated, their chests were decorated by medals and by everything, by those ribbons, and it was a very beautiful spectacle there. And he says that they saluted me. He also says that before some time, he would have been arrested, or he would have been put behind the bars by those officials, by that military. But now the day has come, and the day has come when they saluted the same person. And then it is he speaks of, you can say, he says that he was overwhelmed with history, with sense of history, from the first decade of 20th century to the last decade of 20th century. He speaks about Boer War, which was the war between British Empire and the two Boer states, and he says that it was what actually they started with. They had constructed, that white supremacy had constructed a structure. They had constructed a structure, a system. It was, you can say, he called that structure, the basis of one of the harshest and most inhuman societies of the world. He calls it that, and due to that, everybody. That structure, actually, that structure which was formed by those whites, that white supremacy, it was overturned ultimately forever, and it was replaced by one that recognized the rights, the freedom of everybody, whether it is it is a black person or a white person, regardless of their color or race. It was it. And then he speaks of sacrifices and courage of patriots. He speaks of sacrifices and courage of those patriots who fought with him, who were with him in that particular struggle, and it is only because of those sacrifices and only because of their courage that they could see that dawn. They could see that day. They could experience that day. They could experience they could see that victory. It was because of their sacrifices. And he calls himself, Mandela calls himself some of patriots. He calls himself some of those patriots, because it was because of those patriots that they could see that day. They could see that single day that he became the first black president of South Africa. And then he speaks about he says that the depths of oppression create heights of character. It is because of those depths of oppression. It was because of that oppression that the people with such a great character, they they were born, or they were there, who developed themselves, like those freedom fighters. And he mentions the names of some of his comrades, which fought along with him, and who took part in that struggle, and because of whom he could see the dawn. I would like to show the pictures of those people from the text. He mentions these names: Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Chief Lutuli, and then Yusuf Dadu, and then Bram Fisher, and then Robert Sabokwi. These were the people who fought with him, and it was that apartheid, the policy of apartheid, that created that lasting wound in his country. He speaks of that, and then he says it was because of these people, it was because of their sacrifices, it was because of that oppression and brutality, which gave birth to such courageous men, those people with extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity, and which he he had not known till that time. And it was because of those depths of oppression that created such heights of character. He gives reference to these people. It was from he says it was from these comrades. He learned the meaning of courage, actually. And then he goes on speaking of the people. He says that his people are greatest wealth for him. He says that his country, South Africa, is it has minerals, and it has gems beneath its soil. But he says that those people, South African, they have these gems, they have these resources in their country, they have these diamonds, they have this sort of wealth in their country. But he says that his people from South Africa, they were actually the real gems. They were actually the purer and the finer diamonds that he had. The real wealth of South Africa is the people. It is the people of South Africa. Now, this is the example of a great leader. This is the example of the great leader who who says that the real wealth of South Africa is the people of South Africa. This is the main thing which integrates such leaders, and they integrate, and they are they get the trump. They are successful in integrating the people of their nation. It is because of this vision. It is because of this thought. Once Lal Bahadur Shastri said, integration is born in the hearts of citizens, and when it dies, no army or government can save it. So it was because of this that he could manage those people. It was because of this vision that he could unite those people for an idea, and they fought with him, and they fought, and then they get the freedom in 1994. And then he says that brave man is not one who is without fear, but who conquers fear. Who conquers fear. He says that the brave men, they're not the people who are without fear, but those people are brave who conquer fear, who have fear, but it is conquered by them. Those people are actually the real brave ones. And then he says that no one is born hating. If one learns to hate, he means to say one learns to hate, and he can be taught to love. He says that no one is born hating. Nobody is born hating. Actually, when a person is born, he learns all these things here in this world. He learns hatred in this world. And if he learns hatred, Nelson Mandela says he can be taught love also. He can be taught how to love. Okay, so it was this particular thing. And then he says we have twin obligations. Every person has twin obligation. One to his family, children, wife, parents, and the other to people, community, and country. every person has these twin obligations. And he says that in any humane society, in any civil society, one can do easily, one can fulfill these obligations very easily, especially obligation to family or even to people. But he says that in the country like South Africa, it is not easy to fulfill these obligations. He says that you can if anybody who wants to fulfill the obligations to his people, community and country, he will not be able to fulfill the obligations to his family. He will be put behind the bars. So if you want to fulfill this obligation to your family, okay, you need to do what? You need to rise against such people, against such system. It was South Africa, and this is what Nelson Mandela did. And he says that he was able to do that. Actually, he was able to after 1994, when they got freedom, they were now there was a system. A system was constructed when these both obligations could be fulfilled. But before that, during the 300 years of white supremacy rule, it was not easy for them to fulfill these obligations. And then he says, I was not born with a hunger to be free, but born free. He says that he was not born with a hunger which he could feel at that time when he was young. But he says that he was born free. He was born free. He could do whatever he liked to do. He could, run into the fields. He could swim into his waters. He could do everything. He could go wherever he liked to go. But he says that when he began to learn that his boyhood freedom was an illusion. And then he discovered, what did he discover? He discovered that a young man, that his freedom had already been taken from the system. And then he actually began to hunger for it. He says that he says that he gives his understanding. He gives his understanding of freedom, how freedom changed with time, how his vision or his concept of freedom changed with time. When actually he was a boy, he could run into the fields. Freedom for him means to run into the fields without any interruption, without any interference. As a student, freedom for him means freedom to read and write whatever he liked. And as a young man, freedom to him means to earn money, to earn a livelihood, to marry, to produce children, or to develop his potentials. This is what freedom meant to him when he was young. But when he saw that he could not fulfill his obligations to his people, to his country, to his family, he realized that freedom to him, then he realized that freedom to him means freedom of every person, freedom of his people, freedom of his community, freedom of his country. And then he this is when he joined African National Congress, and he was full of those vigor. He was full of those enthusiasm. He was so excited to work for his people. And then he, at the end of his chapter lesson, he says there is no difference between oppressor and oppressed. For him, he says that everybody, oppressor and oppressed, both of them must be liberated. Both of them must be freed. If oppressed is put behind the bars by an oppressor, oppressor is also the slave of hatred. He is also the slave of hatred. So both of them, they need to be, freed from one from the hatred, and the other from the prison. So both are robbed of their humanity, both to be liberated. Both of them, oppressor and the oppressed, both of them are robbed of their humanity. Okay, one put behind the bars, not allowed to serve his people, and the other, the prisoner of his hatred, could not shower his love to his people. So he says both of them need to be liberated from this from that particular state. So it was this about Nelson Mandela's autobiography, this extract, Long Walk to Freedom. We must be able to answer any question which is asked about this particular chapter. I would like to discuss certain words meaning which would surely help you to understand this lesson. So the very first word is besiege, which means to surround closely. When in the very first line of this chapter, when Nelson Mandela says that he was besieged pleasantly by the dignitaries and the world leaders before that inauguration. Okay, and then we have bedeck, which means to decorate. He when he says about those army or military officers who were who were bedecked by those medals, who were decorated by those medals. And then we have Shiran, which means V-shaped or this shape. It was like when they saw the jets, flying jets, and those those choppers, helicopters over their heads. So he says that the Chiron of those jets, which means those jets which were in the form of V or which were in the form of this. And then we have outlaw. Outlaw means when used as a verb, it means to rebel, or outlaw as a noun means a rebel. Okay, so it was this thing. Hope you understood the whole lesson. Please try to read and try to understand the whole chapter. Watch the video again and again, and you will get to know what you want. Thank you.